Hey Rebels, my name is Matthew Barton and I'm the host of the Rebellion Brewing Podcast. Today's episode is dedicated to one of the most special beers we've ever released. We named this barrel-aged beauty Cherry Lambic. It's big, it's complex, and it took more than 2 years to make. But what does that really mean? And why did it take so damn long? Rebellion's president and CEO, Mark Heise, is here today to talk about the history of the Lambic style, explain a little bit of the science behind it, and give a behind-the-scenes look at how we pulled this beer off. So let's get into it. Mark, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here. We'll see how technical we get, see how much I can remember from all the special words that we're supposed to use. See how badly I screw them up.
Well, first off, what the hell is a lambic?
So lambic is it is a unique, distinct base style. You don't see it very often, but it's a classic historical style from Belgium, particularly in Brussels. And so a lambic style is really what all beer used to be, which was spontaneously fermented. And what that means is the beer is just picking up whatever natural bacteria and yeast might be in the air or inside a vessel. And because of course up until Louis Pasteur was able to isolate yeast cells and realize that yeast is a living, breathing thing, nobody knew actually how beer was made. They just by chance it turned into delicious beer. So everything it was just spontaneously fermented. Anyways, so that tradition is carried on still in Brussels, specifically of Belgium, and so it's a very sour traditional style way of making beer. And to make those ones, they have to age for a fair bit of time too, because there's all these different yeasts and bacteria, and they ferment at a lot slower pace. So most beer, if you're making ales, can be ready usually within 2 weeks. Lagers would typically need 4 to 6 weeks. And as you kind of said at the intro there with a lambic, is you're talking at least 1 year, if not more. So ours took about 2 years. You can get into so they'll talk about. I mean, we can get into all sorts of words like farrow and young lambic and all this stuff, and unblended lambic, but that gets a little and goose, which is blended lambic, aged stuff, 3 years old and more. And yeah. I just threw out a bunch of random nonsense there, but it's a bunch of gobbledygook. Anyways, lambic is a sour beer. People have been drinking. I would try to make it more relevant. So a lot of the sour beers that are being made in North America right now, and that we make here at Rebellion, and lots of other breweries do in Saskatchewan, we call those kettle sours. That still is kind of based on a traditional style. The German Berliner Weiss would come to mind, although that was sour mash as opposed to soured in the kettle. But those are quick turnarounds. You basically sour them in your kettle for 24 to 48 hours and you carry on. And so you get a very sour beer. All you're really producing though is lactic acid in those quick sours. And they taste great. They're delicious. And a lot of us, we're adding fruit or hops or all sorts of different things. But there's not a lot of complexity in them because they're quick sours and they only have lactic acid. Whereas a lambic, because it takes so long, you're getting a lot more complexities and interesting things, and you're using a mixed culture. So there's other bacteria. There's Brettanomyces in there. There's Acetobacter. There is Pediococcus, Lactobacillus, and everything else under the sun. And if you wait long enough, it eventually tastes really, really good.
Why is lambic so popular in beer geek circles?
So it's popular because it's very rare and it takes a really long time. And I would say you have to really know what the heck you're doing to make something taste good. A lot of those beers that I remember one brewery in Edmonton, one of the original craft breweries in Alberta, they made one probably 10 or 12 years ago, and they got slaughtered so badly on Beer Advocate, which used to be the old place that everyone talked about beer. But in fact, even other breweries trashed them because it tasted like puke. rotting garbage, that sort of stuff. And they actually had to recall it. So a lot of things can go wrong when you make these beers. And or even I've had some other ones from in North America, and they're kind of lame. They're just underdeveloped. They're not the cultures that they're using are not complex enough or haven't been used enough times. You have to ferment a lot of sour beers to get that complexity kind of built up. If you have a sourdough starter at home, if you make bread, the first batch or two it's okay. It's not great. But the more you make, the better it gets. And that's, hopefully you're learning something about technique, but it's also just the yeast is just becoming more robust and expressive.
Early, when you were speaking, you were talking about the kinds of yeast you use for ales and lagers. Do barrel-aged beers like the ones we're working with, are labs making those yeasts? Are we doing a wild fermentation? What's going on there?
So we do a bit of both. So the commercial labs, they will sell you, blends or isolates of certain strains of those yeasts. And so we do add some of those. We initially added some of that stuff when we first started making the sour beers on our commercial scale, 2,000 liters at a time. But we supplemented that with the yeast cultures that I started back in 2007 as a home brewer. And I think that's what's really given us a leg up on them. And so I remember another craft brewery who actually does make a really good traditional sour beer. They're in Manitoba, and I remember they first asked me for advice on what to do, and I said you gotta add some other stuff, and come up with some other things and brew a couple different batches. And they said no, we're just gonna use a commercial pitch to start with. And the first batch was okay, but it was kind of lame. It lacked that complexity, and it took about 3 years to even be ready to release. And so again, with them, it's gotten better and better over the years, where it's one of the best I've ever even tasted. But it just takes longer to get that. And you're seeing that again with some of the Saskatchewan breweries that are doing the same thing. They're just, I'm not trying to trash the beers, but you can just tell that the culture just isn't there yet. It's just missing all that complexity.
It's going to take time.
Yeah, and that's the advice that I've given to some other brewers. I'm like, just keep making them. Just keep making these, and they'll get better and better. Don't give up on your yeast culture, or don't dump what you've got and bring in another one, because you're just starting over again.
Interesting. When we're taking the beer out of the barrels, is there something we can harvest from the barrels, or do we just keep it and that's kind of like our cache of the yeast we've been working on?
Yeah, so you can, if there's enough yeast, you can see it, it collects, it kind of is a sludgy paste or whatever. But so even if we empty a barrel and we wash it out, even with like hot water, the bacteria is embedded so deep into the wood that we can just put beer but right back into those barrels, and it'll turn sour again and taste beautiful, because it's almost, and that's kind of why most traditional sour beer is aged in wooden barrels, because it's a great place for these yeast and bacteria to thrive. They just set in and do their thing. So it's a pretty cool thing that goes on. A lot of science involved. The other part of the wood is that you need to let some oxygen in, and so wood has the right, just the perfect permeability. Again, shape and size also makes a difference. So we use full-size bourbon barrels. If you're a home brewer and you're using like a little 20-liter oak barrel or 40-liter oak barrel, there's actually too much oxygen gets allowed in, and you're going to get a lot of acetobacter, which is the vinegar basically. And a little bit of that is nice, but too much is that's that sourness that like gets you in the jowls, and it doesn't feel very good or taste very good. So you want just a hint of that, but not too much.
What kind of barrels are we using? You mentioned it. I want to get more specific.
Yeah, so we brought in these bourbon barrels years ago to make bourbon barrel-aged beers, and we did that, and eventually you basically strip out most of the bourbon flavor that's left, and so then we turn them over into sour barrels. So you're really not extracting a lot of flavor anymore at this point. You get a little bit of that oak complexity, but if you smell or taste the beer, you're not going to be like, oh, I can really pick up the oak notes in it. Yeah, you're just not gonna. It's just again just a little subtle added complexity.
I find it interesting to see that it's like one part just waiting, just time, but it also requires kind of an in-depth knowledge of science now, because we don't have these monks or these old guys who've been doing it for hundreds of years to tell us how to do it. We have to understand the core principles.
Yeah, you got to understand the science to rely on, but again, then you also just have to go on. You have to really rely on your taste buds because you have to know what you're tasting. So these sour beers, like say after even 3 months, if we taste some of it out of the barrel, like it does taste kind of pukey and nasty, and you got to know. But then if you know the science, you got to know that that's kind of they'll call it like the ropey phase or the sickness phase, and it almost literally looks like there's like snot in your glass, and that's just uh, that just tells you that there's actually fermentation going on, and that if you wait long enough, the different yeasts and bacteria will actually consume that and turn it into like lovely fruity esters and other notes and whatnot. So
I know when we talk about Brettanomyces, Pediococcus, all these different types of bugs,
Yep.
essentially, there's a squick factor. It can freak people out who don't understand that beer is made with yeast. And they think yeast, they're like, oh, bread. But then they also think, ew, germs. How do you wrap your head around that when you're trying to communicate with new people for the first time?
well, we certainly don't get into this deep of a conversation for the most part. It's like, hey, it's got cherries in it. It's delicious. Drink it. That's usually the story there. But yeah, I don't know, and not that we want to don't necessarily need to harp on pandemics, but this is why when you were in school and they teach you about biology and all this sort of stuff, there is real world applications and real world understandings of how even when we talk about a pandemic spreading, we understand how yeast and bacteria spread and multiply to make good beer. That does happen, and it's a very good thing in beer. You need yeast to multiply. Like I say, I started out with a very, very small amount of yeast as a home brewer, and I was making 20-liter batches of sour beer, and we now make 2,000-liter batches. Some of the yeast that went in there, I added the yeast and bacteria from bottles of like Cantillon and whatnot, because they would be naturally conditioned, and so you pour out the beer, and there's a tablespoon of yeast left in the bottom, and I would dump that into my sour beers. So that lives on. That's why our beer is so great now. That a tablespoon of some yeast from a beer that I got from Jolly Pumpkin out of Michigan, 10 years ago, is now contributing to this wonderful beer we're making.
What is Cantillon's role in the Cherry Lambic kind of sphere?
Yeah, so Cantillon is kind of like the lambic brewer. They're the most traditional. So a lot of lambics that you'll see on the store shelves, the ones that you can kind of get more is like Boone or now I'm blanking out. Doesn't matter. But the Lindemans, the Cuvée de Rennais is pretty good. But anyways, a lot of their fruit lambics, they're back sweetened, lots of sugar, and they just kind of taste like Alka Pops.
What do you mean by back sweetened?
So when you're back sweetening it, it means that you're basically pasteurizing it to kill off all the yeast that's left, and then you're basically just literally adding sugar to sweeten it up, because lambics are quite sour by nature. That's the whole idea. And so we always used to make fun of those years ago. That you're just cheating. You're just adding syrup and whatnot, and fruit flavors, and that's not really the real thing. But Cantillon, they never do that. They never ever do anything like that. Rodenbach doesn't really do that either. They're a Flanders brewery, not a lambic brewery. But yeah, so Cantillon is like they do it right, and when they add fruit, they add a stupid amount of fruit. It's not this like wimpy, light-handed amount of fruit. So they're kind of like considered the best. Again, about 10 years ago, if you remember when the Willow Park first opened here in Saskatchewan, you could walk into their store and buy Cantillon. It probably took them 2 years to sell it all because nobody wanted it. Nobody knew what it was.
People didn't know.
Yeah, and so the Cantillon's in a 750 ml bottle. Even back then, I think they're about $25 a bottle. If you could even find them now in Canada, you're going to spend at least $40 a bottle. But before the pandemic, if a shipment of Cantillon came into Alberta, people from Montana would drive up and buy it all if they could, and that's if the Alberta people didn't already buy it all up themselves. So
well, now we know we have fans that drive across the province 4 to 8 hours just to hoard cases of the barrel-aged beers we're doing. So maybe we're onto something.
Yeah, exactly. It's cool, right? And so when I say, how long I've been doing this for, so Cantillon, they've been doing it for, over 100 years. And They're wooden barrels and big vats and whatnot. I mean, some of them are 100 years old as well, and their big thing there, which is what's really cool, because they're really worried about disrupting the natural environment and the flora and the bacteria and all that, so they don't actually clean their brewery. So it's full of cobwebs and dust and whatnot. They just have some brewery cats to take care of any rodents and other things that they don't want living in there.
I like that.
But again, and it probably blows people's minds. And you think, ooh, that's gross. Hey, they've been doing it for 100 years. Again, that's a pretty it's neat. You're just relying on nature,
Trusting that traditional knowledge.
yeah. So I think there's some really cool takeaways from that.
What's the difference between lambic and something that people may be more familiar with are sour red Flanders?
Right, yeah. So I mentioned that. So lambic is always pale. It usually has a fair bit of wheat in it, and yeah, I mean that's really the main difference. A lot of the with the lambics, people will a lot of it is kind of romanticized, but they'll talk about like spontaneously fermenting or using a cool ship, where the wort is held in like a shallow container for a day or two. A lot of times they'll put it on the roof of the brewery, and so then and then at night it's they get all the natural bacterias in. But again, that's just a big load of junk, because most of the bacteria is coming from the barrels. That again, it's just romanticizing. So when guys like Big Rock are like, "We built a cool ship," I'm like, yeah, I don't care. Like, big deal. Like,
It's your barrels.
You're just blowing smoke up people's butts, right? Just like it was what was it last week? The Lake of the Woods. They were taking bottles of Imperial Stout and aging them deep in the water, in Ontario
For like 3 weeks.
and like, oh, and it's at this like really cold temperature. It's like, okay, so just take some bottles of stout and put them in your fridge. Like,
I did.
like, that's literally all they're doing.
I did want to ask you. I'm like, wouldn't it make sense if they did it for longer?
Yeah, like it's just hype and nonsense, and
A little bit of theater.
yeah, I guess it's good shtick. I don't know.
I know there's a brewery in Wisconsin that they superheat a bunch of curling rocks, and then they drop the curling rocks into the wort to get their boil.
Yep.
And I don't know why they do that. I think it's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, oh man, I'm just blanking out. I know I know exactly the type of style of beer like that, but
They call it the depth charge.
yeah, again, I sound like a terrible BJCP judge right now, but I have trouble with words lately. Anyways, but yeah, that style. So theoretically, that if you were using like actual real rocks, not curling rocks, and heating them up, that by throwing them into the wort, you're gonna potentially get some flavor off of that, and you might get some additional caramelization because the rocks are so red hot, and then they hit the sugary the wort. So yeah, it's not all a gimmick, but yeah, I think it's more just fun to throw flaming hot rocks into a beer.
They have a huge crowd around, and then the beer like explodes everywhere, and everybody's like, "Oh my god!"
Yeah,
It looks like a lot of fun.
yeah, sure. No, and it's great. I think it's cool anytime you can do the things. Yeah, I'm not trying to like dump on. We do lots of gimmicks stuff too. But, if you're gonna do a gimmick, if your gimmick is about actually making beer, it better actually make the beer better. Is my point. We do all sorts of goofy stuff, and we like wearing dumb clothes or saying silly things or memes or this or that. But that's separate from the beer. We're not screwing. When we make the beer, we're not screwing around.
Yeah.
Yeah, save your goofing off for marketing.
We take the beer seriously, but we don't take ourselves seriously.
Yeah. Anyways, that's my dig at Lake of the Woods Brewery.
Well, let's get a taste of this Cherry Lambic. I haven't even had it yet. I've been actually saving it for American Thanksgiving with my wife. So the plan was to crack it this weekend, but I'll cheat and I'll have a little bit early with you.
Yeah, I would say you can drink it any old day of the week. It's going to be fantastic, but it definitely is it is a perfect special occasion beer. If it is American Thanksgiving, I guess by the time this airs, American Thanksgiving will be over. But yeah, it'd be great at Christmas, any of those things. And it's got such complexity. We'll get into it here right away. But again, the traditional sour beers, they have the same complexities as really good wine. And so again, those sour beers, they came out of Belgium is where, traditionally. And then of course, they're adjacent to France, where, France had the wine. And so these guys, they didn't necessarily have the grapes, but they figured out how to make something just as complex and just as interesting, and that complements food just as well with these sour beers. So
Deadly.
that's kind of where we're at.
I'll let you give a pour there.
Sure.
I know that when people come into the tap room in the past and they say, "Oh, I'm a wine drinker. I really don't know beers." I kind of push them towards our sour red and say, "You know what? Start with this. It's something a little more your speed, and you'll be able to wrap your head around it." And they tend to appreciate it much more.
Yeah, my brother-in-law was here this weekend, and he wanted to try some of these sour beers, and he's not super knowledgeable about craft beers and this and that, but he is a guy that does like sipping on scotch, and he does like really fine red wines, and so gave him some of this stuff, and I didn't really say anything to him, and he brought it up himself. He's like, I can appreciate this like a wine, and I said, yeah, that's bingo. I guess we did our job.
The head is like pink. How'd you guys pull that off?
So again, when I trash other people with terrible fruit beers, you see lots of people, they have pictures. They say, "Oh, come try our blueberry beer," or this or that, and the picture of the beer is gold. There's clearly not very many blueberries in there if the beer is still gold. So in this Cherry Lambic, obviously the beer itself is red, but when the head itself is also pink, there's a lot of cherries in there, like a lot, like a stupid amount. And yeah, you got to use lots of ingredients to make really, really good, flavorful stuff.
Over the Hill Orchard's sour prairie cherries from Lumsden.
And so these are a huge contributor to the complexity of this beer. Even back when I was homebrewing and I was making sour beers and adding the prairie cherries, you get almost like a bit of an almond marzipan note, and we use the whole cherries with the pits. And I think that adding the pits with the pits, you get a little bit of that as well. People do say, "Oh, the pits have arsenic." Yes, sure, there's arsenic in all sorts of fruits and vegetables. The amount is so low, you're not going to get sick by any stretch. But
Apples.
as soon as if we ever mention that, people jump right. "Oh, there's arsenic." Well, yeah, okay, sure, yes, there is.
Apples have formaldehyde. You eat apples.
Yeah, exactly. So, anyways, it's all safe to consume. But again, I had Jeff from Nokomis, who also makes some sour beer with Saskatchewan sour cherries. He tried some, and he was texting me last week, and he picked out. He said, "You used cherries with pits in it, didn't you?" And I said, "Yep." So I'm not just making this up. Other tasters and folks that kind of know their stuff, they're able to pick up on it without me telling them. So must be doing it right.
You've talked to Jeff quite a bit about tasting. I haven't really gotten a chance to pick his brain. He's pretty cagey, pretty quiet when we have our beer festivals. I come and I swarm him and I'm getting photos and shaking his hand and telling him I love his beer, and he's just like, "Yep." Look at this.
Jeff's a pretty unassuming guy, but he knows his stuff. And yeah, so I enjoy Jeff, period, but I enjoy tasting beer with Jeff because he's really dialed in on his palate and can pick up on stuff.
This smells amazing. Like it's really bright.
Yep.
It just jumps out of the cup at you. And it's kind of like smelling a fruit soda, but not that fake sweet cloying. It's a real strong cherry.
Yeah, there's just no way to duplicate that other than to just use a ton of real fruit. And so that's what we did. And again, that's what Cantillon does. And yeah, I mean, I try to look at what we're always looking to experiment and innovate, but I try and look at what the experts do and how they did it. And I spend a ton of time trying to understand how those guys make their beer and make it taste so good.
And it's super, super pink. Like you can't even see through it. Just looking at it, you hold it up to the light and it doesn't have like a flimsy pink-ish quality. It's like, boom.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't think anyone will complain there's not enough fruit in this one. And again, we're really proud of our kettle sours. We have a blackberry sour smoothie out right now. We've got a raspberry one coming out well, and they're delicious and they're meant to be enjoyed and love them. This is just a whole other level, but I think it can be appreciated by anyone. I would just, I think when we first posted it, one person, it said this beer is way too expensive, and so it's priced at $13 for a 500 ml, and that's kind of the going rate for local traditional sours. Blackbridge has one, Nokomis has one, and yes, that's more than our 4-packs. but there's just no way to duplicate this. It's very special beer. It takes 2 years to make. There's tons of fruit in it, and so yeah, I think compared to say trying to get your hands on a Cantillon or something, it's not even close price wise. So, anyways, I encourage people to try it, but I understand if people get their backs up about the price. It really is a special, unique beer.
I think it's worth it. I've got a couple bottles hiding at home, and then I had another friend who came in and I gifted them a bottle, and they live out of town, a 3 hour drive, and they said, "Hey, can you pick up a couple more and just store them for me until I can get back after the pandemic's over?"
Yep. Yep, exactly. It'll hold up for a long, long time. The big jammy fruit note will eventually fade over the years, but these beers can be aged for a long, long time.
In my imagination, when I was listening to you guys talk about this beer before I tasted it, my impression was it would be more tart, but I'm not getting that big, bold, aggressive tart character. Like, it's not making my jaw clench. It's not making me go, you know.
I've tasted this next to our Flanders Red. Our Flanders, so they both probably, if you measure the actual pH, they're both probably about the same. I should probably check our notes because I know the brewers do measure pH of all of our beers. But the acidity is probably about the same. It's just that with the massive fruit addition, is it just kind of it balances that. The fruit it sits on the fruit for about 3 months, extracts the flavors and starts to ferment and whatnot. But it just changes the overall balance. So yeah, if you taste the Flanders Red, and it's not gonna have as much body either. It's a little thinner and the balance is gonna be a little more tart.
What's that sting I'm getting at the finish? Is that
So that can be where you get a little bit of that acetobacter, which is, again, it's not a bad thing. If it's bracingly sour and like hurts your mouth, like, no, that's way too sour. But just a little bit of that, and so that's you almost, not that there's acetobacter in red wine. It's more the tannin is what you're kind of getting, that kind of that drying pinch in some of the red wines, but that's what it makes it so compelling and so interesting and so